parents and everybody to be an inclusive program where everyone is educated successfully, including those students with autism spectrum disorder, from very high functioning to very low functioning. Anybody that works in schools or has been around schools, which is pretty much everybody here at one time, knows that they are a little microcosm unto themselves, and that makes working in them a little challenging. The way this project started, we founded the Autism Center of Excellence at Griffith University in 2010, the end of 2011. And right after we founded, I got a letter from the parent group up in Cairns, and they were very distraught because they were having quite a bit of issues with the schools up there, and they said, can you please come work with us? We have a meeting with the big regional director, and can you help us look at ways that we can have better programs for our children with ASD in schools? So I went up there and I did a focus group, and in combination with that, I also had 15 letters sent to me, and I had 12 people at the focus group, had 15 letters sent to me, and I had another 15 parents fill out focus group questionnaires afterwards. So at the end of this, I had quite an incredible variety of information from these parents, and these were some of the highlights of some of the issues that were happening for them in schools. First and foremost was lack of communication. This was really significant, and the parents were really frustrated. They felt they had lack of options, choices, lack of flexibility in schools. Many parents told stories about going to schools and schools saying, well, we can do this, but we can't do this. And really feeling like their children were being discriminated against as far as their ability to participate. Also, inconsistency was really a big issue. Schools, depending on the parent you talk to, one school would say something very fantastic and would really work with the family, and the school next door would be absolutely, no, we can't do that. Why don't you go to this school over? Now, in Australia, like many of the countries you all come from, we do have anti-discrimination, and we do have disability standards that this is actually against the law. So when schools are doing that, that is not, they're actually breaking the law. And there was a huge difference between what was happening at early intervention programs and what was happening at school. So we had a lot of parents that were really happy about their early intervention programs. And in Australia right now, there's a huge amount of money going into that. And there's also a lot of money going into support for parents. They actually qualify for about $12,000 to access early intervention programs, but it disappears when their child hits 7. So when the child got 5 or 6 and went into schools, they were seeing a tremendous difference. So out of that, we came up with this approach. So our whole school capacity is built on frameworks from several research backgrounds. And it's based on the leadership, what we know about what school leaders need to do to affect learning outcomes in students. It's also it's also based on what do we know we need to do in schools, what is the evidence-based practices that we need to be doing to have outcomes for students with autism spectrum disorders. And how do we use data to inform and get this going? So based on, we established school leadership teams. We got them together to use a process called discipline dialogue, which is, this comes from the leadership frameworks, and they're about schools and communities and programs looking at what they're doing and basically asking themselves, what are we seeing based on the data? Why are we seeing it? What are we going to do about it? So it was giving them that framework to really reflect and look at what they were doing. They were then going to use some self-evaluation tools, which like you talked about, only at a whole school level, to evaluate their current practice, and particularly their current practice in 5 key areas that have been identified in the leadership work that have to happen in schools for learning outcomes for students. And these were professional development, shared leadership, conditions for learning, curriculum and teaching, and parent community support. And then analyzing what they were doing against the evidence base for autism in those areas. Then they developed a systematic process to address gaps for both the school and for individual students. We started off with 3 schools in a pilot study. These were 3 schools that volunteered. They were quite large. One school is about 1,900. It's a P through 12 school. It's all in levels. The other 2 are about 900. One's primary and one is secondary. And in Queensland, secondary is 8 through 12, if you're 8 through 12 at the moment. They approximately had, we started out, these schools were actually already known for doing some good things with students with ASD. They were not average, I would say. They were probably a little bit above average to start with. And when we started, the primary school and the high school each had about 25 to 30 students identified with ASD, and the P through 12 had about 40 to 50. By the time our project is ending, they have each grown by about 30%. Actually, the P through 12 schools actually doubled their number, and this is in a year that we've been working. And I will mention, I forgot to say, our data is a little bit preliminary. As I said, working with schools in challenging, we thought we'd have all the data collected by now, but we had to postpone deadlines a little. We are in the process, as we speak, of collecting the final data. There were varying demographics. One school was much more middle income, and the other two schools very diverse, a lot of individuals and families from other language backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, indigenous backgrounds. So we had a lot of South Pacific Islander families, varying demographics in those schools. Our key goals were better outcomes for students with ASD, competent and confident staff, and increased parent trust and engagement. And that parent trust and engagement was absolutely critical. Oops, and I did something wrong. There we go. Okay. It's interesting, Kristen was talking about a self-evaluation tool, and in my other presentation, talked about the grad cert, and also in this, we have used a self-evaluation tool with teachers. Now, one of the things that we're finding, which I don't know if you found, is that they all think they're competent to start with. And as statistically, at the end, they do rate themselves higher, but the problem we're finding is from a statistical measure, they don't have enough room to go. So we're actually trying to build in measures now of give us exact evidence about what you're doing so we can really measure their competence. So it was really interesting going in at the beginning, talking to these teachers. They all thought they knew a lot, and then by the end, they're thinking, oh, I didn't know near as much as I thought I did. So it's really interesting dealing with professionals sometimes. I've already mentioned the leadership frameworks. But one of the key things that this does is it gives schools a model to follow. And I'm going to talk about that model a little bit more. It involves a couple of day workshops. One is really involving the evidence base on school processes. And the next one is the evidence base on individual processes. So it's very much a tiered level. We did have individual school visits. It's what ended up developing first and foremost out of this project was the need for a mentor slash coach slash critical friend. And I will say that the one thing that has come out that was probably a little bit of surprise, shouldn't have been, but it was, is that person who is not at the school, but is there sort of heading up and keeping the schools going is absolutely critical. I ended up serving in that role in the pilot, but we are now doing this across the whole region with about 25 schools, and we're training a team to do that. So the team is now assuming that with backup from a university or a specialist center, like Autism Education Trust, that they can call if they need to. And also, first and foremost, the schools did set up what we call the School ASD Leadership Team. We just called it the School Leadership Team to start with, but they already had leadership teams and they all got confused. So we started calling it the School ASD Leadership Team. As I said, it's an approach based on first doing good consistent practices across the system, then the school, then the individual. So we talked to the region about what they were already doing at a regional level. We did not implement practices at this level, but we built on what they were doing. And here's some of the things they were doing. There's a huge push right now in actually the country, not to mention the region, on what those disability standards mean and what it means to have reasonable adjustments and not discriminate. So that was one thing they were already doing. And they were already also doing a lot of school-wide positive behavior support across the region. So we didn't have to do that, we could build on that. Good practices already in place. And they were also looking a lot at differentiation. What we really focused on was school processes and programs. And these are some of the ones that we focused at the school level. First, establishing that leadership team, then establishing a school vision for their children with ASD. Now this was interesting because this leadership approach I was involved in with another project involving teaching literacy. When we got to talking about what's your school's vision for literacy, The principals and the school leaders and the parents that are being like, oh, school literacy, well, we have to teach it. Everybody needs to know how to read. That's not a problem. Then we asked them, in this one, what's your school's vision for students with ASD? I think they should be here. We want them to achieve. It was really interesting. So the first thing that happened in this pilot that was a surprise was we probably spent 3 hours with the schools, and then they went back to their schools developing what is our vision for students with ASD and making sure the whole school community knew that. So that was really important. Then they did use a school profiling tool which broke down those 5 key leadership areas against the evidence base. I don't have it, it's too complicated to look at, but I'm happy to send it to anybody. They did an evaluation of what are we doing well, what are we not, what sort of we're doing, and what are we not doing, and then they did prioritize that and developed an action plan to address specific things at the school level. And then for students, we really looked at what are some key students that once you've got those good regional practices, once you've got those good system practices, they're still not, we're still struggling. So those top tier students. So we really looked at what are the targeted outcomes. Now another thing that we ran into that was really interesting, when we talked to schools at the beginning, and I'm an old school person, I'm an old school principal, so again, I shouldn't have been surprised, but it's funny how these things. They were collecting fantastic data all across the school on literacy and numeracy. Absolutely fantastic data on reading and math. Lousy data on social skills, communication skills, problem solving. Now interesting, Australia has just adopted the national curriculum in 2010, and one of the things that is key highlighted in the Australian national curriculum is what they call general capabilities, and in that is communication skills, self-management, self-awareness, problem solving, social awareness. And I'm like, this is fantastic. We can start collecting data. So one of the things that we've really had to develop in this project is a way to collect data in those areas. And we're still working on it because there's not a lot out there. We're also looking a lot at use of goal attainment skills on an individual level. Because that does give you a statistical measure and is meaningful for the individual needs of students. And really look at some students who have absence problems, some students who have behavior, some students who have real significant communication. So we've been working a lot with schools on how to collect data at an individual student level that's meaningful. And I will say, what I have spent an incredible lot of time doing in that mentoring role and that coaching role is teaching people how to write observable, measurable goals. It's amazing how much that was a problem. And these were in schools that were doing a really pretty good job to start with. In the regional one we're doing now, it's worse. Okay, the school leadership team had to have 4 people, bare minimum. Had to have a principal. Core to this approach is the active and dynamic participation of the school leader. This is not a principal saying it's the special ed teacher's job. They have to be actively involved. And we have had in the 3 pilot schools 3 fantastic principals. And what's happened is now that we're going to the regional level, they're saying to the other schools, you can do this too, which is really fantastic. We had to have a head of special education. We needed a representative of mainstream education, classroom teacher, and we also wanted a parent of a child with ASD. Now interesting, some schools are starting to also include parents of children without ASD, typically developing children. So, and that was the hardest one to get, the parent, because they wanted not to get the parent to do it. It was the hardest thing to get the schools to make a time when the parent could come and not just use the teams they had. They said, can we use the teams we had? I said, sure, make sure there's a parent on. So that's good. Now, there is one person missing, and I will admit this, it is an individual with ASD. And we have been talking about that a lot. Now, mentioning that we are talking about 6-year-olds or 5-year-olds up, but that is something that we are working toward, and we did recommend that they look at. This is just some of the things about the whole school profile that they use to assess. I won't spend too much time. Then they developed their school-wide action plan. This was really challenging for them, as I said, not just writing their outcome measures. They were really good at thinking of lots of things they wanted to do at the school level, lots of things they wanted to do at the child level, but they were not very good at figuring out A, what that would look like and what the outcome would look like, so measurable outcome, and B, how they'd collect data to see if they got there. So we've spent a lot of time working on that. Now, what are some of our outcomes? We've been doing some evaluation of data now from the pilot schools. One of the things that's turning out to be one of our most powerful measures,
Nothing.
okay, has been case studies. Each of these schools had developed some fantastic approaches, both at a system level, at their school level, at a teacher level, and at a child level. And we really are now writing this up to highlight, because these are actually serving to be some of our most powerful data. Very qualitative, but really powerful. So at the school-wide level, really developing, one of the schools has really looked at how they're developing a school-wide understanding and resilience around ASD, and how they're getting all the teachers and all the staff involved, and the processes they're undertaking. Flexible service delivery has been absolutely crucial across all three schools, and all three schools have done this really well. Important to mention, this region is unique in Queensland and probably in a lot of Australia in the fact that currently there is no special school in the area. All students currently in the region are in mainstream education, inclusive schools. They're about to open a special school and they're going to do it differently, and that's another kettle. But we have found it has a positive effect that the teachers couldn't say, why don't we send him over here? There was never that option. So they have quite a few children with significant needs, not just ASD, but physical disabilities, intellectual disabilities. So they've really come up with some creative ways to use their money and resources to create flexible service delivery, all the way from what I'll call an alternative program, where they're in a class some of the day, all the way to full-time inclusive placement with peer support, staff support, and occasionally paraprofessional support as well. And they're all three have developed some really good ways that they're able to be flexible, so students are not stuck in one or the other. They move between them. We thought that was really critical, and most importantly, it was critical to show other schools how they did it and the money they had. Because they didn't get any extra money to do this. So it's really important that these principals are going out and saying, geez, this is what we did. You can do it too. One negative side effect of this project has been these schools are now getting all the ASD kids. Word of mouth gets out with parents. I'm a parent too, so you want to go. So these poor principals are sort of going, stop, stop, stop. And they are getting frustrated with other principals who are sending their children. So it's going to be interesting to see how this develops as the regional approach is coming. Also, one thing that they really developed at school level was that the special ed teachers in particular were really passionate, and they were used to doing everything themselves. And they've really learned to share it across that school leadership team, which has been fantastic, because that has created much more of a model of sustainability. I don't know if anybody's ever worked in school, got a passionate person, they leave, and everything falls apart. Whether it's a principal, a head of special ed. So we wanted to build something that had to be sustainable. It's why that school leadership team is so critical. And it was also distributed. One of the schools has like 12 people on their school leadership team, because that's the big one.
Amanda, I'm
okay,
sorry, but
okay.
we
I was in touch a couple other things. Yes, sir?
I ask you to conclude because we
okay,
have to give time to
look, I have all this
translations.
that I can talk about more later if anybody has any questions. But I will say that we have gotten some particularly powerful outcomes. I'm just going to forward to the biggest challenges. And the biggest challenges were, that we've had staff turnover and that we needed that critical friend face-to-face coaching. I've talked about the goal setting and how challenging it was to sort of get those leadership teams set up. So thank you very much. I hope you've gotten a taste of it in the short time we
Thank
have.
you. I'm really sorry that I
No,
had to do
that's
this.
right.
I facilitate you to have personal discussions about this very important topic.